Rock and roll. You probably heard your parents listening to it for years, ever since you were born, especially considering it's their generation's music. It's one of the most well-known and most listened to types of genres of music in the entire world. It's one of the most iconic. Think of all the movies you've seen where people from other countries are talking about going to America and listening to rock and roll. So I'm going to take you through a bit of the history that rock and roll has had and the influence that it's had on our society, because contrary to popular belief, it is so massively influential, and most people just don't even realize it. And that's probably because it just gets overshadowed by newer music coming out like hip hop and rap and pop. So let's begin with this wild influence. Alright, and I'm going to start with how it affected the racial state that America was in during about the 1940s throughout up until about the 1970s is when it was at its height. Rock appeared at the height of those racial tensions. It started from black slaves singing in the fields, and then they became the creators of jazz, which slowly transitioned into rock and roll. The abolishment of the separate but equal meant that since all these people were now able to listen to this jazz, the black artists tended to shift their focus to get their audience, and they also tended to just change the way they thought about music, because now there was much more inclusivity within the entire culture. So this younger generation that was so much more open-minded than the older generation that had previously been around was primarily listening to black artists when rock first came about, as that was what their favorite types of music were, and they knew less about how racial tensions were a bit tense at the time. According to Wikipedia, a lot of the white audiences started showing support for the black audiences, and this caused a massive amount of racial mingling. So let's move on to the more fun part about rock and roll, the drugs. When people think of rock, they usually tend to think of the one thing that all big rockers had in common: drugs. Ozzy Osbourne, the Beatles. They all did drugs. Aerosmith. And you can't think of a single rock that didn't do drugs. And it's just because, especially at that time, medicine was so much less well known, and we had a massive lack of understanding of the actual problems that drugs would cause. And the people who were wealthy enough to afford them didn't see any reason not to. According to drugrehab.com, this can be seen all the way back in the song Cocaine Habit Blues by the band Memphis Jug Band. Sorry, a bit of a tongue twister. When that song came out, it was about 1930 or so, and the band was claiming that cocaine was a great way to find ease and comfort in life. However, in recent years, it can be pretty easily seen. There was a study done by the University of Texas in Austin where they asked older and newer rock stars what their thoughts on drugs were, and most of the rock stars from about 1990 onward tended to find the use of drugs much more taboo. They tended to disagree with that use, and that shows that as time is progressing, we've learned more about medicine and the effects that long-term drug use can have. People have started to realize that drugs are not always the best solution. So let's discuss the fashionistas of the rock, if you will. One of the central points of rock was always the main focus on rebellion. The leather jackets, and the tight pants. And that was just because at the time when rock came about, the biggest rocker that really brought the genre to stage was Elvis Presley. And most people wore normally fitting clothes, not tight, not loose, but Elvis wore lots of loose clothes that moved around and swayed with him when he shook his hips, and it was in a very inappropriate manner to what the current generation of parents had thought. So he started wearing those loose clothes, and a lot of people also started to wear them. And then as they got older, loose clothes became the norm. You can see that especially in like the 70s. You think bell-bottom jeans, long wavy shirts, and that sort of thing. And then as rock tends to be about rebellion, people started to again rebel, and they started to wear those tighter fitting leather jackets and leather pants, real tight. And so that was just because they wanted to be different from the norm. That was what rock was all about. So I know that is a bit of information to absorb. It's not too much, but just a little bit. And I mostly wanted to just give you something to think about how the culture and influence of rock is just so abundant and it's so important to our culture. It helped ease those racial tensions. It influenced our fashion so much. Think about all the people with nowadays that you see with skinnier jeans on and tighter fitting clothes. Think about the idea that we have about how America and rock are so closely intertwined. And I just hope I could have brought some appreciation to this amazing genre.